Okay, we're back with Thomas Taylor's dissertation on Aristotle's philosophy, and we were discussing time. We left off kind of in the middle of a section, so we'll go back a little bit here. Get a running start at it. All right. Kind of want to review a little of this back here. But the prior and posterior of these do not in reality differ from motion, but only in essence and definition. We likewise know time when we give a boundary to motion, distinguishing prior and posterior. And we say there has been time when we receive a sensible perception of prior and posterior in motion. But we distinguish them by apprehending these to be another and another, and also by conceiving that there is something between different from these. For when we understand that the extremes are different from the middle, and the soul says that there are two instants, one prior and the other posterior, then we say that this is time. For that which is bounded by instants appears to be time. Okay, so it's, I think it was something like a measure on motion, according to prior and posterior in time. Because there are other forms of, or not in time, prior and posterior in motion. There are other forms of prior and posterior. And let this be admitted. When therefore we have a sensible perception of the now as one, and there is not anything as prior and posterior in motion, or when we perceive it as the same, and not belonging to a certain prior and posterior, then there does not appear to have been any time, because neither was there any motion. But when we perceive prior and posterior, then we say there is time. For time is this, the number of motion according to prior and posterior. Number, not measure, but I think it amounts to kind of the same thing. Time, therefore, is not motion unless so far as motion has number, an indication of which is this, that we judge of the more and the less by number, but of a greater and less motion by time. Okay. Time, therefore, is not motion unless so far as motion has number, an indication of which is this, that we judge of the more and less by number, but of a greater or less motion by time. Okay, so we know it's a number because it admits of the more and less. That's fine. Time, therefore, is a certain number. Since, however, number is twofold, for we call both that which is numbered and that which is numerable number, and also that by which we number, time is that which is numbered, and not that by which we number. But that by which we number is different from that which is numbered. And as there is always another and another motion, so likewise with respect to time. But the whole of time, considered as subsisting at once, is the same. And we already read through this footnote, so we're going to skip that. Okay, so he says, this is kind of interesting, the whole of time, considered as subsisting at once, is the same. Which I think is kind of what Parmenides ultimately is saying. For the now is in reality one and the same, but its essence is different. The now, however, measures time so far as it is prior and posterior. The now also subsists as partly the same and partly not the same. For so far as it is in another and another, it is different, but this was the now itself. Right. But so, according to its relations, I guess, to other moments, nows differ, but in some other respect, they're all now. But so far as the now is that which it once was, so far it is the same. For, as we have said, motion is consequent to magnitude and time to motion. In a similar manner also, that which is borne along is consequent to a point by which we recognize motion and the prior and posterior in it. But this is in reality the same, for it is either a point or a stone or something else of this kind, but it is different in definition, just as the sophists assume that Coriscus in the Lyceum is different from Coriscus in the Forum, and this also is different because it is in a different place. So I think still just making the same point that in some respect, moments are the same, and in another respect, they're different. Just like a person is the same in some respect wherever they are, but there is a difference of their location. But the now is consequent to that which is borne along in the same manner as time to motion. The now is consequent to that which is borne along. For by that which is borne along, we know prior and posterior in motion. But the now is, so far as prior and posterior are numerable. So I guess what's being said is the now is consequent or measured off of or defined against the prior and posterior in motion. So time is a number on motion, and so the now then being a part of time is consequent to, quote, that which is borne along. We know by that which is borne along, we know prior and posterior in motion, but the now is, so far as prior and posterior are, numerable. Okay. Again, just making the same point, the now is consequent to motion. So that in these, a real instant is the same, for that which is in motion is either prior or posterior, but the essence is different, because the now is, so far as prior and posterior are numerable. And this is especially known, for motion is known through that which is moved, and lation through that which is borne along. For that which is borne along is this particular thing, but this is not the case with motion. That which is called the now, therefore, is partly the same and partly not the same, for the like also may be said of that which is borne along. And we need this footnote here, because I get the basic point. So the now is posterior to motion, just like time is, because time is a subset of motion. But let's see. Let's just see what the comment is, because there's something I'm not quite tracking. So let's see. This is, I guess, Thomas Taylor, or it might just be Simplicius, but we'll see. Aristotle, having observed that time has this in common with motion, that it is generated and corrupted, and again, that it differs from it, because motions differ from each other, but all time is at once the same, says that the cause of this is that the now is one and the same in subject, for this is the meaning of the words, I'm not going to read that, but that it differs in reason or definition, so far as the one is prior and the other posterior. Okay. The now is one and the same in subject, different in definition. Is that the same as insofar as it is a now, it's always the same, but insofar as it's related to other moments? That's the best I could make sense of this kind of dual aspect of the now, which I'm still not tracking terribly well. But according to this, prior and posterior, the now has its being and is the measure of time, according to which time is measured as being another and another, just as number is measured by the monad. Okay, very properly, therefore, so insofar as like the monad is the monad wherever it occurs in a series, the now is the now, that analogy is okay. Very properly, therefore, does he consider the difference and sameness of time according to the difference and sameness of nows. And the time will be the same, indeed, which is bounded by nows indifferently assumed as that which is in different motions. Okay. So I don't know how to incorporate as that which is in different motions, but he's saying the time will be the same, which is bounded by nows that are indifferently assumed. So with respect to their contents, the nows, their independent substrate content, they're all indistinguishable. And so as long as it's the same prior and posterior measure on top of that, then the time will be the same. Let's see. Thus, it is the same day, today, in which one thing is increased, another is whitened, and another walks, since they have the same now, both in the beginning and the end. Okay, so it's not just the similarity of nows, it's that they share one and the same bounding nows regardless of the particular motions that are occurring. But if different nows are assumed, in consequence of some being prior and others posterior, time also will be different. Okay, well, there are still things I'm not quite tracking. Maybe I'm just not woken up fully yet today. But it's, yeah, as long as the nows are, the moments are the same, which bound a piece of time, that time is the same. Time, therefore, subsisting at once, though bounded by the same and different nows, will not be different. Okay. Again, as Aristotle had before observed, that motion is consequent to magnitude, and time to motion, this being the case, those things which are generative of these will also be consequent to each other. Okay, so that which is generative of motion will be consequent to that which is generative of magnitude, I guess. But a point is generative of magnitude, since a line is the flux of a point, and a line is the first magnitude. Okay, but also that also which is borne along, or which is in lation, is productive of motion, and the now is generative of time. Okay, so that which is borne along is prior to the now, because it's generative of motion, and motion is prior to time. As therefore the same point, by its fluxion, produces magnitude, and not by being added to another point. And as the same thing, borne along, produces motion, so also the now, being the same according to subject, bounds and produces time by receiving prior and posterior numbered. Okay, so this borne along idea is not the same as motion, it is prior to motion. So something being borne along is the cause of motion. So also the now being the same according to subject, bounds and produces time by receiving prior and posterior numbered. But that which is moved is the same in subject, Aristotle assumes as evident, because it is either a point or a stone or something else of this kind. And that it is indeed the same stone is evident, though it becomes situated through its motion in different places. Okay, the identity of moving objects is obvious, just taken as self-evident, and that in the fluxion there is the same point is evident. Aristotle says, he's very adamant that lines are not composed of many points, instead it's the fluxion of one point. That in the fluxion there is the same point is evident from that which is generated being continued and not being composed from the contact of points, but with that which precedes remaining, that which is next in order is connected according to the flux of one point. The stone, however, which is borne along, differs in definition in consequence of becoming situated in different parts of that in which it is moved. But that this difference appears to take place, Aristotle proves from the arguments of the sophists, who, transferring this difference to the subject, seem to have collected this absurdity. that the same thing may become different from itself. For they say that Coriscus, being the same, becomes at one time in the Forum and another time in the Lyceum, but he who at the one time becomes in the Forum and another in the Lyceum becomes different from himself. For in thus speaking, they do not preserve the different according to the difference which is assumed, but transfer accidental to essential difference. He shows, therefore, that it is sophistical to suppose that from prior and posterior being different in definition, it follows that they are different in subject. And having shown how that which is borne along is the same in subject, but is different in definition, he says that the now also exists in a similar manner, since time follows and suffers the same things with motion, as was before observed, and the now with that which is moved. Okay. So the stone, however, which is borne along, differs in definition in consequence of becoming situated in different parts of that. So this is a kind of confusing phrase to me. The idea that these points differ in definition while remaining the same in their subject, because definition typically is correlated with that essence. Like when you define a thing, you don't say all of its accidental properties, like its position, location. You say whatever, makes it the essence that it is. So what exactly is meant by different in definition? Maybe definition is just a poorly chosen word, because it seems like for something to be different in definition, it would have to differ in essence. But what's being said is that the nows don't differ in essence. Instead, they differ in, I guess, their relations still is the way I would think of it. We'll keep going. But it is also evident that whether time is not, there will not be the now, or whether the now is not, time will not be. For as that which is borne along and lation subsist together, so likewise the number of that which is borne along and the number of lation. For time is the number of lation, but the now, with respect to that which is borne along, is the monad of number. Okay. 9. Aristotle, having shown how the now subsists with respect to time, that it is as that which is borne along to lation, and the now is more known than time, at present demonstrates the coexistence of them, again, according to their similitude to that which is borne along and lation. For as he says, that which is borne along and lation subsist, since it is impossible for the one to be without the other, if that which is borne along is assumed not according to essence, but so far as it is borne along, such also is the subsistence of the now and time. He also shows the necessity of this consequence from the analogy of that which is borne along and lation, for of that which is borne along the number is the now, this being, as it were, a certain monad which adapts the indivisible to the indivisible. But of motion, time is the number, for as the monad, by being assumed again and again, produces number, thus also the now produces time, and that which is borne along, lation. But time is the number of lation, not so far as lation, as has been already observed, but according to the prior and posterior which is in it, for time is not the same number of motion, but the interval which is between the prior and posterior, these producing the interval by being again and again assumed. But the monad differs from that which is borne along and the now, so far as the monad makes number to be definite, but the other two cause motion and time to be continued. Okay. Time also is continued through the now and is divided according to the now. Okay. I guess the geometrical analogy is important. So a point produces a line by a fluxion, and so also the now will produce a time by a kind of fluxion or, bounding of the timeline through these continuous nows. Although it's not composed of nows, the time is not composed of nows, but it's divided according to nows or moments Time also, which would make sense if it's like analogous to the monad compared to a line, a Gare point compared to a line. Time also is continued through the now and is divided according to the now. For according to this, time and the now are consequent to lation and the thing which is borne along. Time to motion and the now to be something which is borne along, which is prior to motion. In order to have motion, you have to have a thing which is borne along, or a sameness underlying the motion. So the sameness is prior, and the now has a certain sameness with itself, wherever it is. For motion and lation are one with that which is borne along. Motion and lation are one with that which is borne along, because it is one, and not according to that which is, for it may fail, but also in definition. And this bounds prior and posterior motion. According to this also, it is in a certain respect consequent to a point. For a point also, in a certain respect, connects and bounds length, since it is the beginning of one length and the end of another. When, however, anyone thus considers it, using one point as if it were two, it is necessary to stop, if the same point will be the beginning and end. But the now, because that which is borne along is moved, is always different. Hence time is a number, not as of the same point, because it is both beginning and end, but rather as the extremities of a line, and not as parts, for the reason already assigned. For it uses the middle point as 2 points, whence it happens that it rests. Okay. Just again, the points at the end of lines are not parts of points are not parts of lines. Instead, they are limits or extremities. And farther still, it is evident that neither is the now a part of time, nor division a part of motion, as neither are points parts of a line, but two lines are parts of one line. So parts of time will just be time, not moments. So far, therefore, as the now is a boundary, it is not time, but an accident of time. But so far as it numbers, it is number, for boundaries belong to that only of which they are boundaries. But the number, which is of these horses, as for instance the decad, has also a subsistence elsewhere. Okay. So a quote now, I don't know if this is just going on with Aristotle. That time, therefore, I think, is the number of motion according to prior and posterior, and that it is continued, for it is of the continuous, is evident. Oh yeah, I skipped a footnote, didn't I? So back up here, farther still, it is evident that neither is the now a part of time, nor division a part of motion, as neither are points parts of a line, but two lines are parts of one line. So footnote 1, that the continuance of time and its division subsist according to the now, Aristotle again shows from its agreement with that which is borne along and lation. For motion, that is lation, becomes continued and one with that which is borne along, and not with anything else. But it becomes one and continued with this, because he has shown this to be one according to the subject, which again he calls according to that which is. Okay, so the subject of that which is borne along is continued. The motion is affixed to something that is continued in the same. Thus, if a stone were that which is borne along, according to its being borne along, and not according to its being a subject, it will be the cause of continuance. Okay. For it may cease to be borne along, and then it will remain indeed what it is, but it will not produce a continued motion. So when he says it will be the cause of, if a stone were that which is borne along, according to its being borne along, not according to its being a subject, it will be the cause of continuance. So insofar as it is one thing moved along, instead of continuance, he should have said continued motion again here, because obviously something being the same but not moving is also a form of continuance. But it may cease to be borne along, and then it will remain indeed what it is, but it will not produce a continued motion. Since, though, it properly remains one, yet its motion is cut off, being intercepted by permanency. Okay, so he's distinguishing continuance from permanency. I don't know if this matters. For Taylor's usage, he's using continuance as persistent motion, whereas permanency is just remaining what you are. Nevertheless, it is assumed as one according to the definition of that which is borne along, and as borne along, then it becomes the cause of the motion being one and continued. Okay, so by definition this is kind of clarified to some extent. The rock, insofar as it is the rock being moved, that's, according to definition, it is a moving rock. But again, definition, I think description maybe would be a better term than definition, because definition typically relates to essences, but we'll keep going. The now, however, does not only make time to be continued according to its agreement with that which is borne along, but also divides it by distinguishing the prior and posterior of motion, for thus time is divided. But the now, through continuing and separating, not only corresponds to that which is borne along, but also after a certain manner to a point, for when the same point is assumed, it is the beginning of one part and the end of another. So the now, not only insofar as it is the same, not only corresponds to like the rock which remains the same while being moved, but it also is comparable to a point where we take the same point and it is the beginning of one part and the end of another. So one point in the middle of a line is the terminus of each line segment. It also continues the length if it is assumed as one and the same in each part of it, and also divides it, for the division of length is according to a point. The now continues the length if it is assumed as one and the same in each part of it, and also divides it. Okay, so just like you take a point and draw the line from it, you're kind of elongating the point. So the now you take and you elongate, and it provides that same thing comparable to that which is borne along. But also the now divides the line. So it produces the line, the point produces the line, but the point also divides and measures the line. For the division of length is according to a point. In like manner, the now continues and divides time. Okay. Hence, through continuing and dividing it simply accords with a point. But so far as the same point is both beginning and end, we use the two as one, and it is necessary to stop in one point twice assumed, at one time as the end, but another as the beginning, for its being is permanent in position. But that which is borne along cannot be twice assumed, for it is always another and another. So in a circle, geometrically, you can get back to the same point, and it can be exactly the same point, but one thing being borne along. So the difference then between like an object being moved and a point is the point can return back to the original point after a circle, and it's really one and the same. whereas part of being borne along and being moved is being another and another, according to definition, as they're using it here, or description. It is, however, another not because it is different from itself, but because it is another in another and another. So not the now is not different insofar as it's the same, but insofar as the now is in another and another, a changing context. It's always going to be different from itself. For if it were twice in the same, it must necessarily stand still, but it is supposed to be continually moved. Thus also, the now cannot be twice assumed. How, therefore, does time consist in the now being numbered? Not as the same point twice assumed as beginning and end, but as the two boundaries of a line, this and that. But these bound the interval of the line which is between them, this interval being another and another. After this manner, also, nows are numbered as another and another, the one being prior, but the other posterior. But to assume the now twice is impossible, since in this case time would stand still. There is no absurdity indeed in assuming a point twice, since it has position and abides, but the now does not abide, so as to be twice assumed. It is also evident that if a point is assumed as a beginning and end, the line will be divided according to it. And being divided, it is no longer continued, so that neither will the motion in it be continued. But time is continued, since motion also is continued. Time, therefore, is the number of nows, not as if the same now were twice assumed, like a point in a line, but since motion is different, as the beginning of one and the end of another, nor is it beginning and end in the same manner as parts are frequently said to be the first and the last. Interesting. So it sounds like he's saying that the same now is not going to be the beginning of the future and the end of the past. It's like you'll need two separate nows, because we can't assume. That seems odd. What he was saying before, that you can't assume two separate nows because, like, nows have to be borne along in time and therefore have to be in another and another. And so by hypothesis, nows shift and you can't get the same now again. But to have the same now in the middle of a timeline function as the beginning of one time and the end of another, he's saying also does not work. Or maybe I'm misreading it, but let me read this section again. It is also evident that if a point is assumed as a beginning and end, the line will be divided according to it. And being divided, it is no longer continued, so that neither will the motion in it be continued. But time is continued, since motion also is continued. Time, therefore, is the number of nows, not as if the same now were twice assumed, like a point in a line, but since motion is different, as the beginning of one and the end of another. Nor is it beginning and end in the same manner as parts are frequently said to be the first and the last. So this sentence is a little ambiguous. In the beginning of the sentence, I'm thinking he's saying you can't assume a now as the beginning of the past end of the past, beginning of the future, like a point functions, but since motion is different, it's the beginning of one and the end of another. And then the end of the sentence is he saying that actually you can see it that way. It's just very unclear. I'm not going to dwell on it. Indeed, that nows are not similar to a point twice assumed, Aristotle shows when he says, for it uses the middle point as 2 points, whence it happens that it rests. Okay, so if time, therefore, does not rest, the now is not in it as a point twice assumed, but as a beginning and end. Okay, so if time doesn't rest, then it's not in it as a point twice assumed, because we can't have the same now twice, but instead as a beginning and end. So maybe what he's saying is that now does function as beginning and end in one now, not two nows, one beginning, one end. But that it is not a beginning and end in the same manner as parts, but as boundaries, he again confirms from its similitude to things coordinate. Simplicius adds that Aristotle calls the boundary of motion division, motion being divided according to this, and in his treatise concerning motion he calls this kinema. Okay, so it can't function as the beginning and end of two different timelines in the same way that the first part and the last part of two different things are first and last. Instead, I think it is like one point in the middle of a line where that same point is beginning and end of the two different lengths, but we'll have to keep an eye out for that. So far, let's go back up here. And farther still, it is evident that neither is the now a part of time, nor division a part of motion, so neither are points parts of a line, but two lines are parts of one line. Okay. So far, therefore, as the now is a boundary, it is not time, but an accident of time. But so far as it numbers, it is number, for boundaries belong to that only of which they are boundaries. And time is a number. And so, insofar as it's a boundary of number, it will be number, but also, but the number, which is of these horses, as for instance the decad, has also a subsistence elsewhere. Not sure what that means exactly. It sounds like he's saying like the number 10 has a prior subsistence, which seems totally disconnected from the rest of this, but we'll keep going. That time, therefore, is the number of motion according to prior and posterior, and that it is continued, for it is of the continuous, is evident. Okay. Footnote 2, Aristotle, having observed that the now is a boundary in the same manner as the extreme points of the same line, since the now is indeed of itself the boundary of time, in consequence of time being nothing else than that which is numbered of motion according to prior and posterior, and that which is numbered consists of nows. This being the case, he further observes that so it kind of bothers me, he says consists of nows, but we said before, nows are not parts of time. All right. But nevertheless consists of it. And that which is numbered consists of nows. This being the case, he further observes that when the now is assumed as that which is numbered of motion, then it becomes the boundary of motion, and it happens to it to be a boundary. Then also the now is assumed according to the subject, and is in that alone of which it is the boundary. But when it is assumed as the boundary of time, it is not an accident, for it is essential to time. And since that number, which the now is everywhere, but the number which is everywhere is that which numbers, since the decad, which measures 10 horses, also measures 10 men, hence the now is at once everywhere and is not in motion alone, of which it is the boundary not as the now, but as kinema, or that which divides. So again, just rearticulating this kind of dual aspect. In one respect, the now is always the same. In another, it differs. Keep going. Aristotle concludes that he has said by adding that time is continued because it is the number of the continued. For time has its being in this, that it is the number of motion. The essence of time, therefore, being extended with the continuity of the numbered motion, will be itself also continued, for motion not failing, neither will it fail. For time being limited by the boundaries of motion, not so far as they are boundaries of motion, but so far as they are prior and posterior, will also be itself continued, so far as it is time. Okay. The least number however, simply considered, is the dyad. Of course, the number 1 wasn't considered a number. Number involves plurality. But a certain number is partly the least and partly not. As, for instance, of a line, the least number is in multitude 2, or 1. But there is not a least in magnitude, for every line is always divisible. Multitude is discrete, magnitude continuous. And you can't decide whether the least number in multitude is 2 or 1. Kind of strange. Hence, also similarly, time for 1 or 2 is the least according to number, but is not according to magnitude. Okay, Aristotle, footnote 3, having said that time is number and continued, wishes to remove the apparent opposition in what has been said, for number is a discrete quantity, but that which is continued is not discrete. And as he says, in number, the least is the dyad, for this is the first number and is indivisible into numbers. But in continued quantity, there is not a least, for the continued is divisible into things continued to infinity. If therefore there is a least number, but there is not a least time, since time is continued, time will not be number. In solving this doubt, therefore, he uses what he had said before, that time is number, not as numbering, but as numbered. But number is twofold, the one being simply and properly so, and this is that by which we numerate, is definite, and is composed from indivisible monads, and on this account contains that which is least. But the other division of number is as that which is numbered, which is not simply nor properly called number, and subsists in continued quantities. So a continued quantity can be numbered or measured, although it's still the thing itself, the substrate, is continuous. This, however, when it is also assumed as number, as for instance, 2 lines, so the quantity 2 is there, even though lines are continuous, or 2 years, has that which is least. But this is no longer the case when it is assumed as magnitude, for these have quantity according to magnitude, and not only according to number. Hence, back to that sentence, hence also similarly time. For 1 or 2 is the least according to number, but is not according to magnitude. So, insofar as time is continuous, there's not a least number. Insofar as time numbers, the numbering can have a least number of divisions. It is also evident why time is not said to be swift and slow, but much and few, and long and short. For so far as it is continued, it is long and short, but so far as it is number, it is much and few. It is not, however, swift and slow, for neither is any number with which we numerate swift and slow. That's one way to argue. You could also say that time is that which measures swiftness and slowness. And so time itself can't be swift or slow. But 4, if number which numerates were swift and slow, the things numbered would also possess from it the swift and slow. But number which numerates is not swift and slow, and therefore neither is time, since time is that which is numbered of motion according to prior and posterior. So his way of arguing is time as number. Numbering doesn't give swiftness and slowness, so time is not swift and slow. The same time also is everywhere at once, but prior and posterior are not the same, because with respect to mutation, the present indeed is one, but the past and future are different. Okay. But time is number, not that which with we numerate, but that which is numbered. And this happens, according to prior and posterior, to be always different, for the instants are different. The number is also one and the same of 100 horses and 100 men, but the things to which the number belongs are different, viz. The horses and the men. Footnote 5. One of the particulars which have been before observed concerning time is this, that the present time, and which is beheld according to the now, is everywhere at once the same, but beheld according to the prior and posterior is not the same. Aristotle now shows that the same thing may be asserted of motion in which time has its beginning. For the present motion is the same, since there is no difference in this with respect to itself, but it is one according to the common form of the extension of its being. Nevertheless, the past and the future are different from each other. As therefore one motion has same and different, so likewise has all time, which at once measures all motions, for time is not the number of this or that motion, so far as they are such motions, but it is the number of motions so far as motion. Motion in general, not any particular motion, I guess. Hence, time is one, though there are many motions, because it is the number of them, not so far as they are many, but so far as all of them are motions. But every present mutates, yeah, so it's not like different motions have different times. Time measures all these motions, not with respect to their differences, but the fact that they're all moving. But every present mutation is one, so far as it is mutation. Time, however, is not only one in species, but also in number, because it is of one species of motion, according to number, and does not vindicate to itself that a diversities of motion. So time is not, it's not like there are many times with different species of time, the time of a clock, the time of a running person. Instead, time is numerically one. There is one actual time that measures all the diverse motions. But the former time is different from the latter, because motion, though it is assumed as one in number, yet through having its subsistence in becoming to be, it is varied by prior and posterior. So again, this same and different, but the former time is different from the latter, because motion, though it is assumed as one in number, yet through having its subsistence in becoming to be, it is varied by prior and posterior. Okay, so it's one measure, one number of motion, and all motion generically, but still there is the difference of prior and posterior. Afterwards, Aristotle shows why prior and posterior time are not the same. For number, by which we numerate, is always the same, whether it be assumed as prior or posterior, as for instance, the triad. It is not, however, necessary that the things numbered should be any longer the same, for horses are different from men. So time as a number of motion in one respect is the same, but in another, like their subsistence as prior or posterior can differ, just as the same number is the same, but the thing numbered differs in its substrate. If therefore time is number as that which is numbered in motion, and not as that which numerates, so time is the number of motion as that which is numbered, but that which is numbered of motion does not remain the same, it follows that the prior is different from the posterior time, and the past from the future, for the nows by which it is numbered and distinguished are different. For that which is numbered of motion, according to prior and posterior, is different, and it is evident that prior and posterior are different in definition, but in their subject, as in species, the same, for this has already been demonstrated. Okay, further still, as it happens that motion is one and the same, again and again, so also it happens with respect to time, as for instance, the year, the spring, or the autumn. So I think he's just saying that although they can be different with respect to prior and posterior, motion can be Like you can have one and the same type of motion repeated many times, just like you can have one and the same type of time repeated, like the year, etc. Footnote 6, Aristotle having said that all present motion is the same, according to its possession of that which is common, and on this account that the same present time is also everywhere at once, but that the past and future are different, and times are different, now shows how prior and posterior, both in motion and time, may be the same, by existing again and again. So they're different in that one is prior and the other is posterior, but they can be the same in some other respect, like they're both years or days or whatever. Having also before observed that the now is the same in subject, but different in definition, now distinctly shows how he then said it was the same, and that it is the same, just as motion is, by existing again and again. That is, while remaining the same according to species, it is generated again and again, for since motions are generated again and again, as the motion of the sun from the same, and from Aries to Libra again and again, and time is consequent to motion, it is evident that this will also be the case with the year, the spring, and autumn. We not only, however, measure motion by time, but time by motion, because they are bounded by each other. For time bounds motion, since it is the number of it, and motion bounds time. And we say that time is much or few, measuring it by motion, in the same manner as we measure number by that which is numerable, as for instance, by one horse, the number of horses. For by number we know the multitude of the horses, and again by one horse we know the number of the horses. The like also happens in time and motion, for by time we measure motion, and by motion time. And this happens reasonably, for motion is consequent to magnitude, and time to motion. Because these are quantities and are continuous and divisible, for being the magnitude is such, the motion suffers these things, and time because of the motion. For we measure magnitude by motion, and motion by magnitude. For we say that the way is long if the journey is long, and that this is long if the way is long. We also say that time is long if the motion is much, and that the motion is much if the time is long. Since, however, time is the measure of motion and of being moved, and it measures motion by giving a definite extent to a certain motion which measures the whole, just as a yard measures length by giving a definite extent to a certain magnitude which measures the whole. This being the case, for motion to be in time is nothing else than for time to measure it and its essence, for at the same time it measures motion and the essence of motion, and this it is for motion to be in time, viz. For time to measure its essence. But it is evident that it is also for other things to be in time, viz. For their essence to be measured by time. Okay, so mutual measuring is clear enough. I feel like a lot of this is way overcomplicated and could be put a lot simpler, but we're suffering through it anyway to get clear on the historical ideas and how Aristotle is distinguishing these concepts. Some good stuff. The geometrical analogies help clarify what Aristotle is thinking about time. So we'll just keep going through this thing. Tomorrow we'll pick back up 11 Central. So thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.